This is part 2 of Death Row Last Meals, episode 4, Gary Michael Heidnik. We left off right after Gary got his divorce from Betty Disto. She left his ass because he's nuts and was incredibly abusive despite denying these accusations. He does admit to being a philanderer, and imagine you come from the Philippines and you get home and there's a naked woman sleeping in your bed. And then after about a week, your husband begins having sex with multiple women in front of you and abusing you if you have anything to say about it, and ordering you to cook and clean for him and the other women that he's having these affairs with. Gary called these women his spiritual wives. I don't know. It's just a complete cop-out, and that's Gary Michael Heidnik for you. If you haven't watched part 1, go do that, because you're definitely going to need his whole background, childhood background, and everything leading up to part 2. This is when Gary begins creating his baby farm, his sex slave harem, his baby factory harem, whatever you want to call it, after having multiple of his children taken away from him by the state, by Child Protective Services. Gary is dead set on having a baby and the government not being able to do anything about it. He's decided that he's going to start kidnapping women and keeping him locked away in the basement of his Philadelphia house on Marshall Street so that he can start having babies. And ultimately, that is his dream. The first woman he takes is Josefina Rivera. November 26, 1986, Gary Heidnik took 25-year-old Josefina Rivera. She was born in Philadelphia in 1961, and a police officer actually helped to deliver her in the back of his car. She grew up in foster care, and eventually she said that she started smoking a lot of weed and doing coke, and that spiraled completely out of control, and she moved from coke to crack and developed a very serious addiction. As a result of this, she got into prostitution because it was kind of the only work that she could find, because she was an addict.
My parents left me when I was a month old, and some neighbors heard me crying, and the police came, and they took me and put me in foster care. I was in a loving foster care family. I'm still in the same family. From the time I was 4 months old up until now, and they gave me everything I wanted, put me through school, and I had a wonderful childhood. And
But what actually happened then is that you fell off the rails, didn't you?
Yes, apparently. I always say that when, kids have everything when they're growing up, it's like sometimes it's just nothing else to do but to get into trouble. You're just bored, and sometimes life just takes you in a different direction.
It was the wrong crowd you'd fallen into?
It was a lot of drugs and drug dealings, and, it was basically the drugs that had me out on the street.
After her whole ordeal with Gary Heidnik, she wrote a book called Cellar Girl, and she said, quotes, "I now had 2 children, and crack had taken over my life completely. That's the thing about addiction. You don't know it's happening until it's too late." That night in November was the night she would never forget. She and her boyfriend had had a fight that night, actually, and she was angry. She stormed out of the apartment to go work. So she's out walking the streets looking for people who are looking for women. And remember, it's November, so it is cold out. It was a rough night. It was very slow. There weren't a lot of people out, and she almost gave up and was going to go back home until a Cadillac pulled up. A silver and white Cadillac Coupe de Ville slowly drove up and rolled the window down. She walked over, and it was Gary, obviously. He introduced himself as Gary, and Josefina introduced herself as Nicole. She got in the car, and he told her that he had to make a stop before they got down to business. And the stop that he had to make was to pull into McDonald's. They both went inside and got coffee, and apparently Gary just sat there and drank his coffee. Like, they didn't really say much to each other. Several minutes later, he finished drinking his coffee and was like, okay, let's go. He told her that they were going to go to his house, and Josefina was like, yeah, I don't go to clients' houses. That is like a rule that I have. We can do this in your car if you want, though. And Gary told her, look, I'm way too tall. He was like over 6 feet tall, and he told her, I can't do any stuff in the car. It just doesn't work for me. I'm too tall. It's awkward. He basically convinced her that it was worth her while to take the chance and go back to his place. And when they got there, she noticed the 1971 Rolls Royce parked out front. So they're in a Cadillac. She sees the Rolls Royce and she's like, okay, well, this guy has money. So she was looking for someone with money, and she found a guy with 2 expensive cars. The weird thing is, and one of his friends later mentioned this, but he didn't really live in a good part of town. So he had these expensive cars and, unbeknownst to most people, a lot of money in the bank, but he kind of lived in a shitty part of town. Apparently there were actually some bullet holes in the side of the car, and this apparently came from a neighborhood drug pusher who bullied Gary and vandalized his property between 1985 and 1986. One of the first things that Josefina noticed was the strange key that Gary kept with him. He had a key, and he cut the key in 2 pieces. Half of the key stayed in the lock, and then he kept the other half of it with him, so no one else could get into the house. And basically these keys, when he used them like almost like a magnet, they connected back together again, and that's how he opened the door. So no one could get into Gary's house any way. They couldn't pick the lock or anything like that. The door opened into the kitchen, which Josefina noticed was strangely decorated. There was money everywhere on the walls. It was like, she said it was like his wallpaper.
He had a normal house with nothing out of the ordinary, besides the fact that he had change around the bottom of his walls, like coins. In the kitchen, he had like pennies glued to the wall, and then in the dining room, he had nickels, dimes, and quarters. And then going up the steps, he had dollar bills and 5s and 10s and like wallpaper.
They walked through the house, and he was like, hey, do you want to watch a movie? And she was like, dude, no, I'm trying to work here, okay? Can I just get my money? He's like, all right, whatever. And they went upstairs to the bedroom. He gave her $20 up front for her services. They then took their clothes off. She obliged him, and it was over soon after that. She said that he asked her some weird questions, like if she could have children and if she had her tubes tied. Josefina got up to put her clothes on, and that's when Gary started choking her from behind. He didn't choke her out, like to the point where she passed out. He held her in the chokehold and handcuffed her hands behind her back. Then he walked her down the stairs and into the kitchen, and the kitchen had another door that led down to the basement, so he led her down there. The basement was small, built up of concrete floors and walls. It was cold, and there was a single window in there that had been boarded up, and like a little bit of light would shine through it. In addition to the old mattress, there was a chest freezer, a washer and dryer, and an old game table or like a pool table, and also a freezer. In the center of the room, there was a small area where the concrete had been removed. This is where Gary dug a shallow pit into the ground underneath. The basement was very cold, and all she had on was a blouse. She was shivering, and she told him like how cold it was. She was complaining about it and like shivering. November in Philly in a cold cellar is not good. It was very cold. Gary told her to shut up, and he threatened to beat her with a piece of wood if she didn't. Then he forced her down into a hole that he had dug in the basement. And he really had to force her because this wasn't dug deep. Like, he had to take her head and push it forward so it like hit her chest. Then he covered that area with plywood and started stacking heavy weights on top of that. She was scared and crying and screaming, and Gary came back and grabbed her out of the hole and started beating her to get her to shut up. And then he forced her back down into the hole. The next day he took her out and he dragged her over to this old mattress. It was a soiled mattress. He had attached metal muffler clamps to her ankles and put nuts on the clamps and used crazy glue on them so that she couldn't take them off. He had dried the glue with a hairdryer, so they were basically stuck on there. The clamps, the muffler clamps, were connected to one end of a lumber chain. The other end was secured around a large pipe in the ceiling. Get this shit. When he finished doing this to her, he rested his head in her lap and went to sleep. He took a freaking nap in her lap. That first day when Josefina woke up, Gary was gone, and she started getting a good look at the whole basement situation. And she realized that it was Thanksgiving Day that day. I gotta say, for a drug addict, that's a really long time to go without, and she was beginning to experience withdrawals. Gary soon came down to the basement and he brought her food. He brought her an egg sandwich and some orange juice, but she refused to eat it. She was paranoid that he might be trying to poison her. She clearly didn't trust him, and I mean, who could blame her? She said she was starving, but she just couldn't bring herself to trust the food that he was offering her. So he was like, whatever, and he took the food back upstairs and he came back down, but this time he had digging implements with him because he was going to work on making that hole in the concrete bigger. While he was working, he told her his whole plan. He said, I want to have children, lots of them. I already have children, but the state keeps taking them away from me. Well, now I have a way of having children so that no one can take them away. You are just the beginning. You will have my baby down here, but not just you. I want to bring 10 girls here so that they can all have my children. What a freak. After telling her this, Gary took a break from digging and he raped her and went back upstairs. Somehow Josefina was able to loosen one of the ankle clamps, and she got up and she was able to stretch that chain that was attached to the pipe in the ceiling as far as possible and got over to that window that was boarded up, and she tore off the boards that were over the window, and she was able to lift herself nearly halfway out of it and started screaming. Obviously she couldn't get all the way out because she was still attached to this lumber chain, but she was begging for anyone who could hear her. She was screaming for help. Unfortunately, the only real attention she got was from Gary. He came back down to the basement, pulled her out of that window, and started to beat her with his stick until she was quiet. Then he forced her down into the tiny hole in the floor. Then he covered it with plywood, put heavy weights on top of it, and she was stuck down there. He turned the radio on to the hard rock station and turned the volume up to the maximum level. Josefina was stuck down there for about 27 hours until Gary came back to get her, and this time he was not alone.
I was in there for a long time because I know I was in there at least 27 hours because of the times from the radio. The only thing I remember after that is that it was somebody upstairs over top of this hole that was crying, and I know he kept saying, come on, Sandy, you know I'm not going to hurt you. You know I'm not going to hurt you, right?
December 3rd, 1986. 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay. The second woman that Gary Michael Heidnik abducts and keeps in his basement is actually somebody that he knows. If you watched part 1, you will remember Sandra Lindsay. Sandy and Gary know each other. Sandy and Gary met at the Elwyn Institute. She was dating a friend of his named Tony, and apparently Gary also dated her for a time. They lived in his house. At one point, Sandy actually got pregnant and then had an abortion because she was so afraid of being a mother. And when Gary found out about this, baby-obsessed Gary Heidnik, he flew into a rage and he told Sandy that she was an evil person. Oh, the painful irony. Get this though. Gary then offered Sandy $1,000 to let him re-impregnate her. And honestly, there's not evidence that it was even his child to begin with. But Sandy refused. understandably so. So Gary chose somebody who he already knew, and she would trust him, absolutely. Sandy actually described Gary as a good friend who always looked out for her. At least that's what she would tell Josefina Rivera, who was currently locked away in the basement in Gary's house. This is a quote from Tracy Lomax, who is Sandy's sister. Sandy was a retarded adult. All she wanted to do was be like you and me, normal, to fit in. And she did pretty much blend in. Sandy had told us before that this guy named Gary was a bishop of a church and that he was going to take Sandy and her friends to a great adventure. And he was always buying them dinner at McDonald's. The day after Thanksgiving, Sandy was having menstrual cramps. She wanted to go to the store to get some meds. It was around 3 o'clock on Friday, and so she went out. And she didn't come home. 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay. Sandra Lindsay, November 29th, 1986. Despite Sandy completely rejecting Gary's offers, he wouldn't take no for an answer and decided to add her to his harem in the pit in his basement. He took her prisoner. She trusted him. He took her prisoner, took her to his house. The details of how exactly this happened are somewhat unclear to me. The thing about this specific abduction is that oftentimes people who are abused or abducted, kidnapped or raped, oftentimes it happens by someone that they know. So whatever transpired, Sandy recognized Gary as, despite the way that he had treated her, somebody that she could ostensibly trust. When they got to the house, Gary took Sandy down to the basement, and while she stood there watching, Gary pulled Josefina Rivera out of the pit. She was so cramped up from her neck and head being pushed into her chest and being in that tiny pit in the basement with those planks on top of her and the weights to hold her under that she couldn't initially stretch out. She was stuck in that position, and it took her a minute to be able to even properly move. She basically couldn't stand upright because of severe cramping. Josefina said that when she first saw Sandy, she was chained to the pipe in the ceiling the same way that she had been when Gary first brought her down to the basement.
I remember I was in a hole, and I could hear a girl crying in the basement. I could hear Gary saying to her, "Stop crying, Sandra. You know I'm not going to hurt you. You know me. You know I'm not going to hurt you." And then he took the bags of dirt off the board and took me out of the hole, and he's introducing us like we're best friends or something, you know what I mean? Like neighbors or something, like this is Sandra. So after that, the whole next month, me and Sandra was there by ourselves.
Josefina said that Sandy seemed really detached and that she was clearly mentally disabled. Gary left the two women there, and about an hour later he came back with dry crackers and bottled water for their dinner. And then he left again and told the two women that they should probably get acquainted with each other. He left again, and then about 2 hours after that came back and started working on the pit. Basically just hammering away at the concrete to make it much larger. He then took a break after that and had sex with both of the women and then left again. The next morning, Gary seemed to be in a good mood. He brought them a warm breakfast, he brought them oatmeal, and as they were all sitting there eating, someone knocked on the door. Gary went to go see who it was, and then when he came back, he told Sandy that her sister and two cousins had been at the house and that they were basically looking for her, knocking on the door, and that Gary just waited for them to leave because I guess they assumed nobody was home. And that is when he forced Sandy to write a letter. This letter basically was meant to be addressed to her mother, and it was to tell her that she'd gone away and she was fine. She'd call later. Gary's plan was to post this letter from New York so that it looked like Sandy had run away. Although Sandy didn't necessarily seem to fully understand the implications of this letter, Josefina Rivera is not mentally disabled, and she was much more keen to the things that Gary was saying and much more aware of his hostile intentions towards them. Josephina was much more streetwise and had become painfully aware at that point about Gary's intentions. For Sandy, she was mentally disabled, and I think that things seemed more convoluted for her because her and Gary had been friends. So obviously this was a bad situation, but come on, they know each other,
For the first month, me and Sandy were there by ourselves. We didn't take any baths, we didn't comb our hair, right? We spent most of the time in the hole. He would bring us hot chocolate in the morning for breakfast. And then when we went down, at night, he would bring down maybe 2 or 3 hot dogs or something like that. And he wanted to have a farm, and he wanted to have all these women on the farm, and with all these kids, and blah, blah, blah. And
as the days dragged into weeks, Heidnik's behavior became more and more bizarre. He fed them sporadically. He would often engage in having sex. He had a very high sex drive, and that is unfortunate for them. But, the whole point of this was to impregnate the women he was kidnapping, so they were, of course, going to be subjected to rape often. When he wasn't there, the 2 women huddled together for warmth and basically waited in fear for him to return. On occasion, they tried to call for help, but this resulted in savage beatings, which made them cry even louder. Gary had a whole list of rules, and any deviation from these rules would result in being punished, like being beaten or being put in the pit. That awful pit. Another form of punishment that he devised was he would attach the women by one arm, just hanging by one arm from the ceiling for hours. Another form of punishment that Gary would use would be to attach the women to the overhead beam and leave them suspended there for hours by just one arm hanging by just one arm. During these weeks, Sandy's mom was actively looking for her. In an interview later with the newspaper, this is what was said. Janet Perkins had driven past Heidnik's house many times since November, hoping for a glimpse of her daughter, Sandra Lindsay, and a group of her friends, mildly retarded young women, hung out at his house. Terrible things went on in that house, Mrs. Perkins said. Her daughter never talked about it, but her daughter's friends said that they used drugs, alcohol, and had sex. Anytime they wanted to get drunk, they could go get drunk. Mrs. Perkins said, quote, "They just sat over there getting high." Mrs. Perkins said her daughter's friends told her everyone had sex only with him because he was everything, and everybody had to look up to him. Mrs. Perkins said Heidnik also took them to Great Adventure amusement park, took them to parks. He had a van and took the whole group of them, 4 or 5. They thought they were enjoying themselves. She said she notified the police that her daughter was missing and told them her connection to Heidnik. Quote, "I told police about them and kept telling them and kept telling them and kept telling them, and nobody did nothing. They told me that she was an adult." Sandra's mom had, just a few days after her daughter went missing, reported her missing to the police, and nothing was done. She told an officer that she believed that her daughter was being held against her will by a man named Gary. They even knew where the house was. Come on. She told him that she knew that Gary lived at 3520 North Marshall Street, and she even gave him Gary's phone number. She didn't know what his last name was, but, Gary, his address, and his phone number, that's plenty of information for the police to know. And Heidnik is kind of an unusual last name, so I don't blame her for that. She did everything that she could. She basically told them exactly where her daughter was and where to go get her. Crazy. Meanwhile, her daughter is being beaten and raped and tortured in the basement of this guy's freaking house. Apparently, the officer tried calling, but there was no answer. He tried going to the house, but there was no answer, so he just left. When Sandra's mom got the letter that Gary made Sandy write, she showed it to the police. And shortly after that, they even got a Christmas card. Josephina said Gary came down with a box of Christmas cards and he made Sandy write in the cards. He made her write, "Dear Mom, I am all right, don't worry, love, Sandy." Then he put on gloves, gave her a $20 bill, and he had her put it in the card. He wouldn't touch it himself. In my opinion, Gary's not insane. He is beyond aware of what he is doing. He wanted Sandy's fingerprints on the letter, and then he had her lick the envelope so that her DNA was on it. Gary left, and he was gone for a pretty long time because he drove from Philly to New York to mail the letter to Sandy's mom. This next part is horrifying. When Gary came back, Josephina told him that she knew that he had been gone for hours and hours. And he was like, how do you know that? And she told him that she could hear, they were in the basement, which is like near where the garage was, and she could hear the car coming and going. Gary did not like that. Josephina said she remembered Gary saying, quote, "Well, I have a solution for that." He went upstairs, got something, came back down, and the thing that he got was a Phillips head screwdriver. He said that he was going to puncture her eardrum so that she couldn't hear. And she remembers him digging around in her ear with this screwdriver and said that it was incredibly painful.
He would drive screwdrivers into your ears.
Right.
For what reason?
To damage our eardrums so we wouldn't be able to hear him coming and going in the house.
It's actually beyond belief, isn't it?
Yes.
The sheer evilness of that man. Did you ever get a sense that he regretted any of what he did after he did it?
You know, I kind of thought he did, but I just saw within the last few months, I saw a tape of him talking on to somebody, and he was like, "I didn't care. I just wanted I wanted everybody just to shut up." And I was like, my God, I could have just, then, you know, at that moment, in a second, I could have just strangled him.
Apparently, long term, they could still hear, but there was some hearing loss involved, obviously. And she also said that whether they could hear or not, that it didn't make a difference because the garage was right there. So when the door would open and close, the ground would vibrate. So they still knew when he was coming and going. Also, a perforated eardrum will heal, depending on the level of damage. It also depends if it gets infected or not while it's healing. So Josephina, luckily, could still hear. She said that she could hear people upstairs in the house and that she could hear when she said she could hear when the third victim arrived at the house. Sandy's mom got the Christmas card, she showed it to the police, and they basically said, she's just another runaway. So Gary's plan freaking worked. But he did try one more thing. He went to go find Tony, Gary's old friend, to see if he knew anything. He found Tony at a McDonald's in West Philadelphia. This is the McDonald's that Sandy used to go to a lot. Tony was also mentally disabled, and when the police officer asked him if he knew where Sandy was, he just said, no, just like that. Nope, doesn't know. The officer then asked Tony if he knew what Gary's last name was, and Tony tried to spell it for him. He said Heidake, Heidake, Gary Heidnik, which I guess is, you know, pretty close. Heidnik is a weird last name. And honestly, who's to say that Gary even ever told them that his name was Heidnik? He could have said Heidake. We don't know. I still don't get why this was even necessary because the officer had Gary's frickin' address. So if you just look that up with the phone number, it should say his full legal name there, and he had been to the house already. It just seems incompetent, in my opinion. Why aren't you also talking to neighbors? Why aren't you also looking at the freaking house and making someone come to the door, just going back and back and back, or watching it? Like, I get that there are police resources and this stuff isn't that easy, but like, that's a lot of information to have very, very early on. He picked up Josephina on the 26th of November. He got Sandy on the 29th. That's only 3 freaking days. And then a few days after that, Sandy's mom files missing persons report. No one else needed to get hurt. In my opinion, they should have been busting that door down figuring it out. There were plenty of red flags. And if they looked into Heidnik's past, they clearly would have seen the crazy arrest history and all of the time that he spent in mental institutions, all of the red flags, everything. It just seems like obvious. And I get that there's like a whole due process. There's a whole thing of like needing evidence and a search warrant and stuff like that. But like, oh my God, it's just painful to think about. It really is. Gary's defense attorney, Charles Peruto Jr., said, "You have good cops and bad cops and stupid cops and smart cops. We had a lazy and stupid cop," which is a lethal combination for Sandra. There's definitely a problem of systemic racism in the United States. That's just a fact. And this is West Philly in the 80s. And I'm sure that Sandy being black had something to do with it. I don't know. I think that it was a mix of a lot of different things. And it's really freaking sad. After finding nothing, the search was dropped. Meanwhile, Josephina and Sandy are in Gary's freaking basement, and he's dug the pit to be big enough where they can both fit in it together. Fit in it. It's cramped. It's dire straits. Josephina said that she and Sandy started getting to know each other, and when she realized that Sandy had known Gary for years, she started asking her questions about Gary to try and figure out things about him. She's smart. She realizes that she needs to learn everything she possibly can about Gary, and he might have made a mistake bringing in someone who had known him for years, not thinking that she could be a wealth, like she could be a source of information for Josephina and the other women that he eventually would bring into the pit of hell. 3 days before Christmas, like many residents in Philadelphia, Gary is out shopping, but he isn't looking for Christmas presents. He's looking for his next victim. Anxious to expand his harem, he cruised the streets looking for a suitable subject. As he turned onto Lehigh Street, he found her. Lisa Thomas, a 19-year-old black girl, was walking alone on her way to a girlfriend's house, and Gary pulls up next to her in his Cadillac. Apparently, he rolled the window down and leaned out and said something suggestive to her, and it actually made her mad, and she said, "I'm not a prostitute." So Gary quickly apologized and then offered her a ride instead. This is smart of Gary, I'm not gonna lie. I guess Lisa was mollified by his change of expression and his apology and impressed by his car. So she was like, okay. She got in the car and he did give her a ride. He's like, "Where are you going?" And she told him, "Just around the corner to my friend's house." So he actually drove her to the friend's house and he waited out in the car for her to pick up whatever it was she was picking up at her friend's house. So that's actually pretty smart on Gary's part. That is how you're gonna gain trust with a victim. Then he asked her what she was doing, and she wanted to grab a bite to eat, and drove them to a restaurant. While they were eating, Gary asked her if she wanted to go to Atlantic City with him the next day, which is an exciting prospect for a 19-year-old girl. But she was like, "Man, I don't have anything to wear." And Gary was like, "Say less. I will take you shopping." He pulled out a $50 bill and was like, "Let's go to Sears." He said he'd buy her some outfits. In Lisa's own words, "He asked me if I wanted to make some money, and I said, no, I'm not a prostitute. He pulled out a knife and said he would stab me." So these two versions of the story are very, very different, but that is what Lisa Thomas told, the news. I liked his car, right? It was a Cadillac 87. He drove her to her girlfriend's house and then to dinner and drinks. He offered to take her to Atlantic City, New Jersey, but she declined, saying she did not have proper clothes. Lisa Thomas said, quote, "He gave me $50 and took me to Sears and Roebuck. I bought 2 pairs of jeans and 2 tops. He said, could he put them on me? And I said, sure." So that all lines up. The comment she made about the stabbing was wild, but I don't know, it wouldn't make me get in someone's car. It would probably make me freaking run. But I don't know. I mean, Gary clearly has a way with people, clearly. And I don't really know what exactly happened You know, Lisa Thomas went through a lot. So being asked about this after the fact, maybe he did pull a knife on her then. Maybe it was after she got into the car. Or maybe it happened at a completely different time. I don't know. But that is what she said. So apparently when they got back to the house, Gary put a movie on and gave her a glass of wine. Apparently she had been taking allergy medication and became drowsy from the combination of the allergy meds and the wine. She fell asleep on the lounge or the couch that they were on, and when she woke up, she discovered that she was undressed. From that point, before she was able to even clear her head, he took her upstairs to his bedroom and basically forcibly had sex with her. She started trying to put her clothes back on and was like, "Could you just take me to my friend's house, please?" And without a word, Gary started choking her until she complied with his demands. Quote, "After he had sex with me, he choked me. He almost killed me half to death." In the phone conversation with her mother, Mrs. Thomas described how Heidnik had started to choke her. "With my hands, I said, wait a minute, I'll do whatever you want," so he let me go. He said, "Be cool and nothing will happen to you." Then he took me down to the cellar. "I saw bags down there, looked like body bags. I said, 'There's bodies in those bags, isn't there? You're gonna kill me, you're gonna kill me.'" Gary told her that he would not kill her, and he handcuffed her to a pipe. Mrs. Thomas said that she saw no one else in the cellar at the time. Then he got these girls out the hole. It was a big hole. He said he was going to introduce me to my two friends. Mrs. Thomas thought he would show her bodies. Quote, "He took the lid off the hole and I saw two girls coming out of there. One was named Nicole and the other Sandy," Mrs. Thomas said. So obviously, just for a recap, Nicole is like the street name, was like her dancer name or prostitute name. Now he has 3 women in his basement. Gary makes them all sandwiches and brings them the food, but he says they're not allowed to eat until he indoctrinates Lisa into the group by making her give him a blowjob. He forces her to do this and then chains her up like the other 2 women. Then he went upstairs and Josephina, Sandy, and Lisa ate their sandwiches and they talked. Firstly, they noticed a pattern. This is some crazy white guy and all 3 of them are black. What's the deal with that? They're basically trying to figure out what's going on. The pit at this point can only fit 2 women. Gary's got 3 of them down there, so one of them has to stay outside of the pit, and for this he chooses Josephina. She essentially becomes his favorite. Josephina is very smart. Her whole plan with this was, I'm gonna give him what he wants, which is love and admiration. He wants us to be his wives. Like, she got it, you know? This birthing harem, this big family, this psychotic plan. She seemed to understand that on some level. She understood what he wanted, and so her goal to escape was to gain his trust and to give that to him. So she quickly became his favorite, and this did cause some issues between her and the other women, but she stuck with her gut and she did what she had to do. She said, quote, "If I was more on his side, it would be more in my favor." Josephina said that after about a month there, so around Christmas Day, he started to take her upstairs. Lisa Thomas's mom is looking for her now, and she had a similar experience trying to find her daughter as Sandy's mom had. Police said that her daughter was an adult and that there was little to be done. Quote, "All I heard was that she was missing because she wants to be missing," she said. At this point, Gary takes a 4th victim. New Year's Day, 1987. Deborah Johnson Dudley. Josephina Rivera says that she remembers it being New Year's Day when Gary brought down Deborah Dudley, a 23-year-old black woman, to join the other 3 in this birthing harem cult freak show. She said, "On New Year's Day, we were out of the hole and Gary brought down another girl into the basement. Her name was Debbie. After he put the shackles on Debbie, he put her in the hole. Debbie kept hollering all night long and he came down and beat her a couple of times with a stick. Gary used 2 sticks. One had nails at the end and it would leave sores on their ass. Debbie refused to cooperate. Debbie was not having any of this. I mean, none of them were, but Debbie's way of handling it was to not freaking put up with it. She was gonna be loud, she was gonna fight back, she was gonna make noise, and she was gonna let him know that she fucking hates him, and this isn't okay. And she's not gonna make it easy for Gary Heidnik. She's not going to be a cooperative prisoner. People have all kinds of responses to adversity, and Debbie's was basically, fuck you. Adding Debbie to the group of Josephina, Sandy, and Lisa was difficult. It caused a lot of tension because she was very unwilling to behave the way Gary wanted her to. She had a huge attitude, and I don't blame her for that, but that is the way that it was. Once Debbie got there, the beatings became more regular because Gary wouldn't just punish her for not obeying him, he would punish the other women too. Josephina said, quote, "From the beginning, Deborah kept acting up and hollering and screaming and, being defiant and rebellious. And I remember right after he had beat her so bad one time, I was like, well, this is not working, so why do you want to sit here and make him torture you? You just really got to straighten up and pull this together." She's like, "Why? Am I going to die here?" "Absolutely you are if you keep going in this direction that you're going in." With 4 women there, the situation was more complicated than ever, and Gary started to pit them against each other. Josephina was his favorite, Sandy was his old friend, but she was seemingly the most docile one. But whenever he would leave the house, he would put one of them in charge. It was usually Josephina. When he returned, he expected the one that he put in charge to tell him if the other women had been misbehaving. And get this, if the leader reported to Gary that the other sex slaves had been misbehaving, he would beat them, but he would make their fellow cellmate do it. If he felt like the leader wasn't beating them hard enough, then he would just beat all of them. And if he came back and there was no report of any kind of infractions or problem, he would beat all of them. I guess he just didn't trust it. Basically, there was no winning for anyone, whether you were his favorite or not. It was lose, 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 lose situation for everyone, except Gary, I guess. Gary absolutely loved music, and he would blast music super loudly, sometimes to drown out all the noise or crying or whatnot, but also just because he loved music. And with Debbie there was more noise to drown out because she would not stop screaming. She was very, very loud and very angry. I found a newspaper article with this crazy drawing of Gary Heidnik. He looks insane, and it lists all of the music that he had. It lists the music that he would play for them, and it lists like albums and songs that he had, like basically Gary Heidnik's playlist. The creepiest song on this list, in my opinion, was My House by the Mary Jane Girls. Boy, you can just best believe I'm the only girl in your life. I'll be your sugar in the morning and the sweet stuff you need at night. So when you need a little peace of mind, come on over, boy, anytime. I'll keep you happy and so satisfied in my house, in my house. Ooh, 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 in my house. He's superstitious, writing on the wall. Very superstitious, ladders about to fall. 13-month-old baby broke the looking glass. 7 years of bad luck, the good things in your past. When you believe in things that you don't understand, then you suffer. Superstition ain't the way. Okay, I'm done. But you gotta admit, some of those songs are a bit on the nose and a bit creepy to be listening to while you're stuck in Gary Heidnik's house of horrors in a pit. I made a playlist here on YouTube with all of these songs. If you want to listen to Gary Heidnik's playlist to get more of a sense of him and the experience that his victims had, Go check it out. Imagine never being able to listen to Stevie Wonder again. That is so depressing. It is around this time that Josefina Rivera really started to gain Gary Heidnik's trust. I'm sure that having Debbie be so incredibly defiant made any level of obedience from the other girls more noticeable, but Josefina Rivera was dead set on this being her escape plan. She was like, I'm gonna do what I have to do. And Gary Heidnik wants obedience, he's gonna get it. She basically was going to convince Gary Heidnik that she wanted to be his slave. She wanted to be his wife. She was gonna be the first wife in this harem he was building, and she was gonna give him children, and they were gonna be a family. She needed to display her loyalty to him through obedience. This was her strategy. When Debbie arrived, a lot changed. Apparently, he not only was forcibly having sex with all of them, but he started making them have sex with each other, while he watched, of course. It was also around this time that he installed a toilet in the pit. Installed might be too strong of a word. It was more like a porta potty that he just put inside of the pit, so that while he kept them in there, they could crawl over to it, basically. Like, there was no plumbing. But he did provide a toilet, and he also gave them baby wipes so that they could try to keep themselves somewhat clean. Eventually, he allowed them to take baths before he made them have sex with each other. While they were there, the women had all lost weight, like, noticeably, because Gary Heidnik, while he would feed them, it just was not sustainable, and the amount of stress that they were under, like, you know, he'd make them sandwiches sporadically and oatmeal and give them like crackers and water, but that was pretty much it. The amount and the type of food that he would give them seemed to change based on his mood. Some days he would just give them bread and water. The following day, it might be stale hot dogs or peanut butter sandwiches. Then he finally solved the food problem by giving them canned dog food and beating them until they ate it. Obviously, it's early 1987, and Gary actually ends up hearing from Betty. She contacts him, and this is the first time that he discovers that he has a son. And he discovers this because she contacts him asking for child support. He learns that he has a son named Jesse John, and that January he ends up going to family court. Gary has never had any kind of relationship with Jesse John, or the daughter he had with Anjanette, or the son that he had with Gail Linco. Like, I mean, that's why he's doing all of this. So in the midst of him creating this birthing harem, it is ironic that he is contacted for child support payments and ends up going to family court while these women are being held in his basement. In letter 5 to Dr. Jack Apsh, Gary talks about this. He talks about his divorce with Betty and his decision to create his own family after their separation. I needed bonding and closeness of a wife and children. To achieve this, I reached to an even different social group and made one of the biggest mistakes of my life, falsely thinking that Oriental women would be the greatest wives ever in existence. I married a Filipino. I probably arrived at this conclusion by watching too many Susie Wong reruns. As a social group, maybe Chinese or Japanese make great wives. Filipino women are another story. You've encountered some of these difficulties, I believe, since you actually came into contact with Betty. If you need more proof, just ask Peruto. You and I can both commiserate with him. Anyway, my union with Betty was partially successful. It produced a healthy, active, bouncing son, Jesse. However, it also produced a great mental anguish and supplied none of the companionship or bonding I needed so much. It was so hectic that at one point she had me incarcerated for a villainous rape charge, and at another point I locked myself in the garage and tried to commit suicide. And even at another point, I had myself committed to Codesville trying to escape her. If you want more information about what happened in this letter, watch part 1 of episode 4 of Death Row Last Meals, Gary Michael Heidnik. As you know, his letters are so long. As you know, my marriage had deteriorated and my relations with the handicapped disintegrated. Again, I was alone. What to do? What to do? What I did, you already know. A unique way of looking at what I did in my disturbed state of mind was to create my own social group, or family if you wish. It was a social group in which I was the only male, the only economic provider, the patriarch, so to speak, and which was available to me 24 hours a day. Since I couldn't achieve a sense of belonging to any other existing social groups in American society, I endeavored to create my own social group, one that had to accept me and couldn't abandon me, and had to provide me things I needed: love, bonding, children, companionship, etc. For instance, anytime I felt a need to talk, they were there. Where could they go? They had to listen. Oh my God, Gary. So that was his disturbing explanation for why he kidnapped all these women. And he's not done. January 18th, 1987. Gary Michael Heidnik took 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins. Jacqueline was the youngest member of the horror harem. Jacqueline grew up in the projects, and she was 12 when, in her words, she started dealing with the streets. She said that she had a good mom, and that her mom acted as her mother and her father, but that she was a very rebellious kid, and that she was not good with rules. She actually ran away one time off looking for love, and she ended up with a 26-year-old man when she was just 12 years old. Jacqueline said, quote, "He was selling drugs and I was using them. I was just a young girl trying to find her way in life with an older man that didn't set no directions. The people that's supposed to be in my life to guide me the right way, they wasn't, because I wasn't letting them. So I was going off the deep end of the streets, and that's when I met Gary Heidnik." Jacqueline was out on the streets in North Philly turning tricks, looking for a John, and Gary Heidnik pulled up in his Cadillac. She said that she and another prostitute actually argued over him because they needed the money. Like, this is my client. No, this is my client. And I'm sure Gary absolutely loved that. Apparently, in the end, he picked Jacqueline, so that other girl definitely lucked out. Gary said that he wanted to spend time with her. He talked to her. He took her out to eat. This seems to be his MO. He always does something that gives them the opportunity to leave, but it's such a normal situation that why would you? You know, like taking Lisa to her friend's house and like, yeah, go into her house. She gets out of the car and then comes back because, well, he let me go in the car once. He let me out of the car before. Why would he not let me out again? And then they go out to eat, and then he takes her shopping. So they went out to eat, and Jackie said that she basically let her guard down. She said Gary was like, "Hey, I just need to stop at my house real quick because I have to pick up a cake for my daughter's birthday." Total freaking lie. And she was like, okay, whatever. So she went into the house with him, and Gary loved arcades, and he actually had an old Dig Dug arcade game set up in his house. It actually wasn't that old at the time because Dig Dug came out in 1982 and this was 1987. So it was a new arcade game at the time. It's a maze arcade game designed by Namco. But he had a whole like arcade machine, and they ended up playing video games. So she's playing Dig Dug with her back to him. I've actually played it before. It's fun. I love video games, so, you know, it's one of those situations where I could see myself ending up playing video games, and it's just so creepy. I do find it eerie that they played Dig Dug, though, because, you know, Gary liked to dig holes in the ground. I did read somewhere that they were playing Mr. Do, which is another maze arcade game from Universal that was also released in 1982. So I'm sure that there were a number of different arcade games that they played. Though in the most recent interview with Jackie, she said that they played Dig Dug. So apparently, at first, he was playing the game with her. And then he slowly started to back away. So he was like behind her. She said that this started to make her very nervous, and that she started to try to like look over her shoulder, but not make it look like she was trying to look over her shoulder, but like she was clearly nervous. This is when alarm bells start going off. Like they're playing this video game and he's now like slowly backing away behind her. She can just feel like, oh God, like that sense that someone is watching you from behind. She said that she started getting very nervous and that he just jumped her and got her in a chokehold, and that they started kind of fighting. And that's when she noticed that like behind the video game console there was a hammer and a pickaxe, and so she starts trying to grab it, but she can't reach. As before, he had sex with her and then dragged her to the basement. But when it came time to chaining her, apparently these shackles were too big for her tiny ankles, and he had to use handcuffs instead. When he brings her down, 3 women are out of the hole and 1 woman is in the hole, so there is room in the pit for Jacqueline, and he immediately puts her down there and then puts the planks on top with weights and bags to hold them down in there. He goes back upstairs and Jackie starts screaming. She's terrified, and apparently Josefina came over right away and was like, I got you, it's gonna be okay. Josefina basically told her, shut up, trust me, we're gonna get out of here, but you have to be patient. About Jacqueline, or Jackie, Josefina said that she was 18 and that she was so young that she wasn't sure Jackie really understood the severity of this situation. I feel like she probably did, but I could be wrong, I don't know. That's just Josefina's take on the whole thing. Then Gary came back down and took Jackie out of the hole and beat her. The day after, Gary imprisoned Jacqueline as part of his harem. She is number 5. It was Josefina Rivera's 26th birthday. He bought everyone Chinese food and a birthday cake and even a present.
How much verbal exchange did you have with the girls down there in the basement?
At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties there for one thing. I had a Christmas party and a New Year's party.
For Josefina. They all sat down there and sang happy birthday to her and ate their food. Josefina opened up her present and it was a pair of slippers. Gary was playing records and the song Stand By Me by Ben E. King came on, and he and Josefina danced to it. Then apparently Stand By Me by Ben E. King came on and Heidnik danced with Josefina, you know. When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. Oh, darling, darling, stand by me. It's been a while. Anyways, that's kind of weird. They danced together. Awkward. This is a quote from Josefina, and it is so incredibly sad. I don't think I've had a birthday party since then. As an added surprise, Gary brought a bottle of champagne. Josefina later said that Gary was actually in such a good mood, and he had like got it in his head somehow that both she and Sandy were pregnant, which was not the case. But that's why he was so chipper and excited. After this, things go incredibly downhill. Gary kills his first victim. Some people actually speculate, and Gary himself later bragged about killing 6 women, but some people speculate that he had killed women before this. Remember Dorothy Knox? How she disappeared? We don't know what happened to her. February 7th, 1987, Sandra Lindsay is murdered. Sandy actually had an issue with her jaw, and she was not doing well. She had been having a hard time eating. She was just not eating a lot, and she really wasn't faring well in the basement. She lost a lot of weight. Sandra had been restricted to a diet of bread and water, and she also had a chest cold. She was also denied clothing to keep warm, you know, except for the shirt that she was wearing. The night before she died, she'd also been subjected to sleep deprivation because Gary made her stand the whole night. Gary doesn't admit the conditions that these women were in. He just seems completely detached from the fact that it was very cold. It was February and they were in this damp cellar, and she basically suffocated to death because she wasn't eating and Gary forced bread down her throat. So Sandra is basically choking to death while the other women are chained up watching. Gary had gone upstairs at this point and was watching a made-for-TV movie called A Place Called Home. Gary got it into his head that Sandy was pregnant, and because she was having trouble eating and the issues with her jaw that she was having, he decided to force feed her, which ended up suffocating her. Because she wouldn't eat, Gary took that as a sign of her being disobedient, so he ended up hanging her by the ceiling by one arm and force feeding her. If he truly believed that she was pregnant, maybe he would have had any kind of consideration for the child and her, and that's Gary Heidnik for you. He was never going to be a father. Basically, he starts force feeding her while she's hanging there, but because of the issues with her jaw, she's not chewing the food quickly enough. He was trying to force bread down her mouth while he was beating her while she was hanging up by one arm. Josephina apparently was trying to help get Sandy to do something. I don't think she was physically capable of doing it, but she started yelling, "Eat the food, Sandra, eat it, eat it."
And he was trying to make her eat, and she was putting bread in her mouth. Because when you got on punishment, first he would just give you water, then he would give you bread and water, and then you, like, I don't know, I guess like he would take away all your privileges, and then you'd have to start all over again, you know. Her whole body just fell, and she was just like, the only thing that was holding her up was just the handcuff, you know. And I kept saying, "Lisa, go over there and tap Sandra and tell her, you know, see what's wrong with her," because her whole body was collapsed. And she kept tapping her, and Sandra didn't move, you know. So he just puts the key in the handcuff, and her whole body falls, and her back of her head hits the concrete on the, well, like the hole, the surrounding of the hole, the back of her head like hits the corner of this hole. And he's like, "She's dead. You know, she's dead." And it like really had me so messed up because Sandra had been there with me from the beginning, you know.
She was dead. He was very upset and angry by this. He believed that he lost another baby. And of course, then he shifted the blame to the other women because he seems to lack the ability to take responsibility for his actions. Jackie apparently said that she heard Josephina tell Debbie, "You need to tread very lightly now because Gary blames you for Sandra's death for some reason. I don't know why, but the women were having issues together. You know, Jackie and Josephina were having problems. Jackie accused Josephina of being in Gary's ear. Jackie said that Josephina was telling Gary things about the other women and blaming them for stuff to take the attenuation. What the fuck? Jackie said that she was telling Gary things about the other women and blaming them for things to take any kind of spotlight or fault off of herself, to take the attention off of herself. When all of this was said and done and Gary was on death row, Jackie said that no one really knows what Josephina was like and that she makes herself out to be this hero, but that Jackie doesn't actually see her that way. Though Gary's defense attorney, Chuck Bruto Jr., said, quote, "Josephina was the only victim who was clever enough to know that he was constantly going to be watching her, so Josephina would discipline the girls when Gary wasn't there. She convinced Gary that she was his ally, that she would help him." So you can see the two sides of the story. February 8th, 1987. Cooking. The following day, Gary dismembered Sandra's body in the bathtub. Josephina said that she remembered seeing Heidnik carry Lindsay's limp body up the stairs and heard the noise of an electric saw. Then there was a horrible, awful smell. Josephina, Jackie, Lindsay, and Debbie basically couldn't figure out what it was. One of his neighbors, Doris Zabolka, said that it was awful. It was so bad, and her father actually said, quote, "It smells like a dead body." They tried to go over there, but no one would answer the door, so they called the police. Police go over there, and Gary answers the door, but he steps out of it and closes it and stands in front of it and kind of leans up against it. He told the cops that he was cooking a roast and had burnt it in the oven, and that's what the smell was. And the cops left. That was it. That's the second time the cops had been to his house and left, and the third time that people had come to Gary's house under suspicious circumstances. What really happened was that Gary had decapitated Sandra and put her head in a pot to boil it. Then he put the rest of her body parts in a food processor and mixed it in with dog food. Gary Heidnik then fed this to the other women. Other parts of Sandra's body were put into plastic bags and kept in Gary's freezer. Jackie said, quote, "Next thing I know, he came in the basement with some rice and dog food. That big piece of meat on there, I didn't know what it was, and then I realized that whole time he was up there burning Sandy, cooking her so he can dismember her body. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here, 'cause I ate her."
They were watching an Apple dog food commercial or some kind of food dog food commercial, and they were like saying, "Damn, that dog food looks good. It looks good enough to eat." So Donna says, "Gary, Deborah says that she would eat dog food and stuff if you would give it to her, but that's not what she said." So Gary goes upstairs and he gets the dog food and he brings it downstairs and he makes these three eat them, the ones that was on punishment. He was taking Sandra's body and grinding it in a food processor and mixing it with this dog food that he was feeding these three other girls.
Apparently, Gary had a problem dealing with Sandra's arms and legs, so those are the pieces that he basically just kept in the freezer, and he actually marked them as dog food.
After one of the victims died from torture, Heidnik told Douglas and Ray he didn't know what to do with the body.
I'm sitting there, trying to figure out what the hell to do, what the to do, I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I dismembered the body and I started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
Trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
Why do they kill?
The primary motivation is to manipulate and dominate and control that victim. How can this inadequate nobody, for the first time in his life, call the shots and decide whether or not this victim should live or should this victim should die?
He cooked her ribs in the oven and boiled her head in a pot on the stove. Jackie was having a serious problem with Josephina at this point. She said that whenever Gary would come downstairs, Josephina would jump up and be like, "Jackie and Debbie were doing this," and that she would snitch on them, and Gary would then beat them. Josephina said that they came up with a plan because Gary would take Josephina upstairs and let her take baths and freely walk around the house. So they were telling her, "You need to get a knife. Okay, you have to get a knife in the kitchen when you're up there. You're gonna bring it back down and we'll hide it." And then when Gary came downstairs, Deborah was gonna get on all fours and kind of kneel over so that he would trip over her, and then they were going to stab him to death. Josephina said, "No, that's a terrible idea. I'm not going to do that because, first of all, he doesn't bring the keys down here, so we would just be stuck down here with a dead body. That's not going to help anyone." And she called their plan ridiculous. She said that she never let on what her plan was. Josephina never told them that her plan was to gain his trust because she said that the dynamic between the women had become kind of cutthroat. Like, the best way to win favor with Gary was to give up one of the other women. So Josephina basically didn't say anything. She said that she didn't trust anyone, and they didn't trust her. She said that she didn't want them to reveal her plan to Gary because it would undo all of the work that she had been doing to gain his trust. Apparently, Gary asked Josephina if they had come up with some kind of plan or whatever, and she was like, "Yeah, there was a plan, but I squashed it. That's not gonna happen, you don't have to worry." Why Gary would ask in the first place, I don't know. Maybe he overheard something. Or maybe Josephina just told him straight up that they had come up with this plan to fully convince him that she was loyal. Apparently, after this, Gary walked downstairs and just looked at Jackie and Debbie and was like, "So, I hear you have a plan. Tell me about the plan. You know there's no way out of here." He unchained Deborah and took her upstairs for a few minutes. Apparently they were gone for about 5 to 8 minutes, and when she came back down, everyone was like, "What happened? Like, what the hell happened up there?" Deborah said that Gary showed her Sandy's head, her decapitated head, in this pot cooking on the stove, and he says, "If you don't straighten up, this is gonna be you." Gary basically said that Debbie was, quote, a pain in the ass, and that he wanted to get rid of her. Deborah is murdered March 18th, 1987. A couple days go by after Gary showed Deborah the head, and, she is now back to her normal self, completely fighting any attempts of Gary to break her or tame her. Gary is beyond tired of this and starts a new torture method, electrocution. He said he actually learned this torture method while he was in the army, and that it was like his form of electric shock treatment. Gary plugged in an electric extension cord and then took the end of it that wasn't plugged in, and he stripped off the insulation from the extension cord. So it's just all exposed. Then he would hold that with the power on and touch the chains that were around the girl's ankles and wrists, watching in detached amusement as they would, basically be shocked, trying to dance around to escape the current. As before, this has somewhat become a thing, but Josefina was exempt from this punishment. In Deborah's case, though, he specifically filled the pit that he had dug with water and made her stand in it. And that's how he shocked her. At one point, Gary left Josefina in charge, or so he claims, and said that she needed to be the one to do the shocking. So apparently Josefina was the one who was holding this live electric current into the water that Deborah was standing in. I'm unclear how long this went on, but too long. Jackie says that it's almost like Josefina and Heidnik were together, like a couple, like they were on the same page. She said it was at that moment that she was watching, Gary Heidnik's not even there. She said it was at that moment that she was watching Josefina actually electrocute Deborah, that Jackie realized, are they actually a couple? Like, are they together? Jackie said that she watched Deborah slump over with her face just in the water in this hole. Apparently Gary said, quote, good, now my basement can go back to order because now I got rid of the troublemaker.
Heidnik told agents Douglas and Ray that he had a routine for the women he held captive in his basement.
8, they go down in the hole in the morning, board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. Okay, now on this particular day...
Got a radio down here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Playing real loud?
Yes.
Why is that? To drown out any noise?
Right.
In case because you're leaving the house sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't
I was... I'm not holding nothing back. I realize that's incriminating. That's incriminating for me to say that in a state of mind. I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment, too,
The radio didn't stop the women from screaming for help, so Gary Heidnik tried shocking them into silence with electricity.
You do say that you were electrocuted as punishment.
Yeah.
And you did that systematically for some time.
No. Only several days. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So you got a progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. I don't mean I hope so, but I mean, that's what I was trying to achieve, to make them behave.
So it's unclear, Gary's blaming Josefina for this death, but in my opinion, Gary Heidnik is responsible for that murder. He even said, I got rid of the troublemaker. Maybe Josefina held the current in the water, but she was clearly under duress. She's a victim like everybody else. And this is just how she chose to deal with it. This is the way that she tried to survive. This is a direct quote from Jackie. Riviera, she killed Debbie. We all could have got out of there alive. A lot of stuff that she did, she didn't have to do. Josefina felt like she did have to do it. Jackie felt like she didn't. Maybe there's some truth on both sides. I don't think we can really judge people in that situation. Apparently, after this, according to Jackie, Gary brought her and Josefina and Lisa all a cigarette, a beer, and a can of dog food. After this, Gary took Deborah's body and put it in the big deep freezer that was in the basement with the women. Then he made Josefina sign a piece of paper. This piece of paper said that Gary and Josefina electrocuted Debbie while making her sit in chains in a pool of water. That they did this together, and he made Josefina sign it, and she did sign it. According to court documents, Gary told Josefina that she would no longer need to be handcuffed because the incriminating note would prevent her from going to the police. Appellant also told Miss Riviera that even if she were arrested, he would simply go to court and act crazy by saluting the judge, among other things. Appellant explained to Miss Riviera that somewhere in the law it states that if a person acts crazy for a certain amount of years, his case is eventually thrown out. Gary then took this letter upstairs and put it somewhere, and then he came back down and took the chains off of Josefina. Jackie said, quote, "'Cause she killed Debbie, she got to walk around the house freely." Jackie feels like Josefina completely betrayed the other women. She actually said that it was as if Josefina took on the traits of Gary Heidnik. Josefina said, quote, "I was free, but I wasn't free because these other girls were still in the basement. Even if I got away, the first thing he's gonna do is get rid of them." Following Deborah's death, Gary apparently softened up a little bit. And it might be because Deborah was the troublemaker, so it was a bit calmer in the house. It might also be because he thinks that him and Josefina have like bonded together, and now he has a girlfriend finally. After this, he brought an additional mattress and blankets and pillows and even a television down to the basement. Plus, poor Josefina earned the honor of being able to share Gary's bed with him. She was like his constant companion at this point. He started taking her out of the house. He would take her to restaurants and on shopping expeditions, and Josefina said that he confided in her and straight up told her that if he ever got caught, he was going to act insane. He said that he knew how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He said that he had been fooling with the authorities for years and even was able to qualify for disability payments. One day, Gary and Josefina were driving around the countryside of New Jersey, and Gary stopped the car outside of this heavily wooded area, and he is like, "I think that this would be a good place to keep Deborah's body." Apparently, this actually was pretty short after he had killed her. Her body had only been in the freezer for a few days. On March 22nd, Gary and Josefina loaded Deborah's frozen body into the trunk of his car. So it had actually only been a few days. So March 22nd, on March 22nd, it actually had only been a few days, and Gary and Josefina loaded Deborah's frozen body into one of his cars, a Dodge van, and they drove out to the countryside to dump her body in the woods. This is a very secluded wooded area called the Pine Barrens.
So he wanted me to go with him to dump Deborah Dudley's body over in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And we went over there at night, and we went over, and he found this place, and we came back. And then he had put the girl body in the freezer. So he took her body out of the freezer, and he, like, pulled the plastic bag off her. And he said, look at her, look at her. I was like, I don't want to look at her. He's like, well, look at her. And so then he put her back in the bag and put her in the trunk of the car, and we drove back out to the Pine Barrens. And he pulled into this little marsh, it was just a little space within the woods, for him to turn off in. And I remember it was so dark out there, and I was like, oh my God. It was like he might have been going like 3 minutes, but it seemed like an hour, and my heart was just pounding in my chest because I'm like, what if he decides to leave me out here? I could hear him taking the plastic off her body, and her body hitting the back of the bottom of the trunk. And I remember hearing his footsteps walking on the twigs and the leaves. And he came back and got in the car. He came back across the bridge to Philadelphia, ended up going to McDonald's and eating. And this McDonald's was a McDonald's that was open like 24 hours a day. And he was sitting there like nothing ever happened. And he was like, you want something to eat? And I'm like, no, I don't want anything to eat. And I'm like, You know, like, it's like all these people are in here, and I'm like, oh my God, we just dumped the girl's body over in the grandparents, you know what I'm saying? But this wasn't fazing him at all.
The very next day, Gary says that he needs to find a replacement. He actually takes Josephina out with him to find another victim. This is his replacement sex slave wife. On March 23rd, 1987, 24-year-old Agnes Adams is abducted. Gary was like, let's go cruising out together like a couple. How romantic. Gary slowed his car by a black prostitute, and apparently both Gary and Josephina realized that they knew who Agnes was. Agnes and Josephina had worked at the same strip club together, so they recognized each other. And Gary was one of Agnes's previous customers, so she trusted him. Agnes had already been to Gary's house on 2 separate occasions. Apparently the first time he picked up Agnes, he drove home, but a car was completely blocking all of the parking where he lived, so he actually turned around and took her back. He also paid her $10 for the trouble of all of that. The second time though, he took her to his house and they had sex and he paid her, and then she left. He didn't try to like attack her or anything. In a letter to Dr. Apsh, Gary writes about Agnes. He gets her age wrong. He says that she's 18. Agnes actually was 24 years old at this time. Perhaps one of the most intriguing girls in the cellar was Agnes. We know her as Donna. She had an interesting life even though she was only 18. I've just read an article in National Geographic about Anchorage, Alaska. It reminded me of Donna. You see, she started being a prostitute at the age of 15 in Hawaii and got involved with a pimp who put her to work in Anchorage. I always planned to get more details from her but didn't for some reason. I don't know how she wound up in Phila? They're like Philly, but is that what Philadelphians say? I don't know. Obviously, Agnes was not going to get lucky this time. She trusted both Josephina and Gary and got in the car. They took her back to the house, and Josephina hung out in the kitchen while Gary took Agnes upstairs and had sex with her. And then she found herself stripped, chained, and locked in the basement, just like the others. Josephina does something very interesting at this point. She tells Gary, look, I really miss my family. I have not seen them in months. If you let me go see them just for a short period of time so I can just assure them that I'm okay, I'll bring you back a new wife. So she's telling him, like, I'll help you. I'll bring you back a present. I'll bring you back another girl. Gary really wanted to expand his family, so he agreed. March 24th, 1987. Escape. Gary and Josephina go out so that she can see her family and so that they can pick up a new girl. Josephina basically said, it's been so long since I've seen them that if I show up with you, they're probably not gonna respond very well to that. So just let me, walk around the corner and I'll see them first and it'll be totally fine. It'll be much smoother if I can just show them that I'm happy and healthy and that I'm okay. Gary parks his car at a nearby gas station. Josephina knows the area very well, of course, and she actually picked the area because she knows where the payphone is. It is right around the corner. So he drops her off and she walks calmly around the corner. Right as she turns the corner, she starts running. She gets to the payphone. That is when the Philadelphia Police Department receive a phone call from a woman claiming that she is abducted and that there are other women who are abducted in this man's basement and that they need help now. Several minutes later, 2 police officers show up. A few minutes later, 2 police officers show up, John Cannon and David Savage. They pull up in their cruiser and they meet Josephina there on the street and she's explaining all of this stuff to them. They found it pretty hard to believe and they ask her, okay, well, show us where the chains have been locked around you. So she immediately lifts up her jeans and shows them. And I mean, there is a mark there. There's scars basically from the chains being there for so long. And they immediately, their demeanor changes and they're like, okay, this is serious. Where is this guy? Arrest. Police cars pull up to the gas station right behind Gary's car. He's still just sitting there in his Rolls Royce hanging out. And he actually, when they walk up to the window, he actually rolls the windows down and he's like, what's the problem, officer? Didn't I pay my child support? At the time, he had $2,000 in cash on his person. This is a quick passage from Probing the Mind of a Serial Killer. Heidnik knew that if he didn't continue to manipulate and control, the fantasy would end. He thought that the greater amount of control he could render, the greater chance would be that he could fulfill his goal, the goal of his own family, and a Heidnik-dominated society. In fact, when he lost control of Riviera, it did actually all end. The choice of Riviera was, as mentioned, a miscalculation. Often, when lost in the fantasy, the serial killer makes a mistake in the world of reality. The delusional-based thinking is often muddied on the level of the real world because the fantasy is all-consuming. When the desire becomes so overpowering that the killer needs to reinforce the fantasy by acting out through manipulation, the killer can miscalculate. In effect, the killer manipulates himself into believing that he can outsmart everyone in an external world. It is this self-manipulation, this thinking, this response pattern that often leads to the apprehension of the serial killer. Dr. Apsch makes it very clear that Gary was way too lost in his fantasy and way overtrusted Josefina Rivera. Gary is detained. Police take him in around 1 a.m. and they now have probable cause to enter 3520 North Marshall Street, so they head over there. They find gruesome evidence. Just before 5 a.m. on March 25th, 1987, a squad of police under the direction of Homicide Lieutenant James Hansen arrive at 3520 North Marshall Street. Unable to gain access via Heidnik's intricate lock system, Hansen gave the order to break the door down. One of the first officers through the door was Dave Savage, one of the men who had arrested Gary Heidnik. Following Josefina Rivera's direction, he and his partner, Officer McCluskey, went straight to the basement. When Savage entered the small room, he saw two black women asleep on a mattress in the middle of the room. Despite the cold conditions, their only covering was a thin, dirty blanket. As he approached them, they woke up and began to scream until Savage assured them that he was a police officer who had come to release them. He noticed that the women were chained to a pipe in the ceiling and wore nothing except thin blouses and socks. They identified themselves as Jacqueline Askins and Lisa Thomas. When one of the officers asked if there were any more women in the house, Thomas pointed to the sheet of plywood on the floor that had plastic bags filled with soil piled on top of it. Pushing aside the bags and the board, McCluskey saw the nude figure of Agnes Adams squatting in the bottom of the pit. After lifting Adams out, the police removed the girls' chains and took them upstairs to await ambulance. With the girls freed, the police turned their attention to the search. In the kitchen, Savage found an aluminum pot on the stove, which was badly scorched and contained a yellowish fatty substance. On the kitchen counter was an industrial food processor which had been recently used, possibly for raw meat. In the kitchen, they also found 6 plastic bags containing human body parts. Inside the stove, he found an oven dish containing a charred piece of bone that resembled a human rib. Up to that point, Savage was still struggling to believe what had really occurred in the room, but when he opened up the fridge, what he found removed all doubt. Lying on a shelf in the freezer compartment was a frozen human forearm. Over several days, police searched the house and yard, detailing every piece of paper and material they found. They excavated the front and backyards, but did not find any further human remains. In the house, they found a closet full of pornographic magazines, all of which featured black women. Although the house and surroundings gave the impression that the owner had been a disturbed person, existing only on a veteran's pension, they later discovered that Gary Heidnik was in fact a rich man, having amassed an amazing $550,000 in a Merrill Lynch stock market investment account. While the search was continuing, Heidnik was being questioned in custody as police attempted to unravel the life and crimes of the scruffy individual the press were calling, quote, a vicious madman. Jackie said that when she left, she was 46 pounds. She had to rehabilitate her muscles and learn how to walk again properly. It really puts that quote that she said earlier about how if it wasn't for Deborah and having to eat her body, that she wouldn't be there. It really puts that into perspective. Around 5:30 in the morning, the police sex crimes unit started their investigation. I'm going to read this really quick from Stellar of Horror. When the captives gave statements to the police, they said Heidnik had boasted of killing 6 women whose names he rattled off: Sandy, Debbie, Sally, Jody, Marcy, and Carol. 2 things added strength to this claim. At the time, no one had seen either of Heidnik's 2 former live-in women, Dorothy or Anjanette Davidson, in years. So Heidnik admits to killing Sandra and Debbie and then lists other women. First they read him his rights and then they begin the interrogation. Some of Gary's responses, most of them actually, are ridiculous. In the interrogation, I'm not going to read it because it's so long, but in the interrogation, he tries to tell police that he's Creole, that he's like part black and Creole. Dude, his grandfather's name is Adolf. When I mentioned in part 1 that Gary had identity issues, this is what I meant. I wish there was audio of this whole thing. Gary Heidnik's bail was set at $4 million. One thing that happened that is rarely talked about is that Cyril Brown, Gary's friend Tony Brown, was also arrested. He was released on $50,000 bail and had to agree to testify against Heidnik. I think it's because he dated Sandra and had lived in the apartment for a certain amount of time, and I guess they thought he was somehow involved. He was not. But apparently he was possibly facing murder charges in the Sandra Lindsay case. A court psychologist, Eva Woldolchelsky, I don't know how to say her name. Eva stated, quote, Heidnik currently tests within very superior limits of the range of intelligence. He assimilates novel material quickly and has accumulated an above average level of academic information. This man is extremely alert to environmental details and has an above average comprehension and judgment. The district attorney, Ronald Castile, said, "You don't run into many cases like this. It's something you think you'd see in a video movie." Now, enter Terry Heidnik. He is 41 years old at this point. Terry said that he and his brother were both schizophrenic and had often received psychiatric care and tried to kill themselves on several occasions. He described his brother as violent and said that when he heard the charges against him, quote, "I believed it right off the bat." Gary was very capable of that. While incarcerated, very, very early on, Gary tries to kill himself. It hasn't even been a whole month since his arrest. Goes on over and over again. He tries multiple suicide attempts and constantly fails. The suicide attempt after suicide attempt is very important because the prosecution uses this against him in trial. This specific time he tried to hang himself with a t-shirt on the shower pipe at the Philadelphia Detention Center. Gary wrote about this suicide attempt to Dr. Jack Apsh in a letter. This is what he says. "Another suicide attempt I made was in jail. That's the one that made the papers. You don't think that was malingering too, do you? Even the prison was convinced of my sincerity, and they're some of the biggest skeptics around. I almost succeeded in hanging myself in the shower. I tried 4 different times in my cell, but I couldn't get enough height. There was a bar on the desk in my cell, but it was only 3 feet high. Still, on those 4 occasions, I managed unconsciousness each time, but that was all. There was something magical on the t-shirt I was using." You're fucking nuts, Gary. "I used it in the shower and it worked there too. I told the guard I was taking it into the showers to wash, but for some reason he got suspicious and peeked into the shower and saw me hanging there. In getting me off, he even cut my head on the shower head, but I didn't feel any pain since I was unconscious. They took me out and laid me on the floor and gave me oxygen. I was out for several more minutes before coming to. They then took me to Guthrie for observation and tests. The officer's name who caught me was Officer Love. He was reprimanded severely for not catching me sooner. Yes, they reprimanded him, not praised him. Later, he even asked me how it felt to be dead. Hanging is an interesting phenomenon, and I can describe it as someone who has experienced it like no one else can. The perception that you can strangle and slowly asphyxiate isn't necessarily so. I could never hurt myself that way. Oh my God, Gary. My God. Gary was taken to Guthrie Medical Center where he was said to be pretty much fine, but he had an abrasion on his neck. Gary adds, quote, "By the way, I did achieve a little fame and notoriety for the hanging attempt at DC, after they completely changed all the shower heads so no one could do that again." This year, Gary also had a bladder disorder, and he writes about that too. On April 3rd, Terry came out with his big interview. An AP article came out called "Brother Tells of Abused Childhood for Murder Suspect." Terry told all about their childhood, and this is where I have read in part 1 and this part quotes from Terry about things he said about their upbringing. Terry says that from August 1962, when Gary got out of the military, to March 1968, when he was arrested, that he had 13 suicide attempts. That's a lot. Gary was so out of it too. Like, listen to this. He's talking about a psychiatrist while he was at the psych ward. This is Dr. Wainwright from 1986, back when he was admitted. Remember, this is his admission after Betty had left him, and like a couple months before he started kidnapping. Quote, "I did have problems relating to her. She kept me on strict suicide precautions for the longest time, wouldn't even allow me a sheet, blanket, or pillow. I was cold. I used to have to curl up in my mattress trying to get warm, but the heartless broad didn't care how much I suffered." Gary, you literally did the exact same thing to your victims, 2 of which you killed. Very detached, very psychotic. The papers even talk about Gary being a huge contradiction. Okay, moving on. At Gary's arraignment, he claimed that the women that he had in his basement were already living there when he moved in. He entered a plea of not guilty. On April 23rd, 1987, pretrial began. Heidnik appeared in court for the first time since his arrest. Beside him sat his counsel, Charles Chuck Peruto. Heidnik had selected Peruto as an experienced, sharp-minded defense attorney, and because Chuck was known for defending sensationalist cases. The reason for the appearance in court was to officially determine if the prosecution had the probable cause to hold Gary Heidnik for the crimes he had been charged with. For Assistant District Attorney Charles Gallagher, the preliminary hearing was a mere formality, and he presented the state's case against Gary Heidnik. Heidnik stood charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated assault, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, indecent exposure, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, simple assault, indecent assault, and other associated offenses. The most damning evidence against Gary Heidnik was testimonies from his captives themselves. Lisa Thomas described in detail the things that Gary did to her, the beatings, the rape, how he chained her up. Josefina Rivera, too. In a clear, confident voice, she relayed what Gary Heidnik did to her. She was very graphic when she talked about Sandra Lindsay's death and also Deborah Dudley, and she admitted that she was the one who pushed the cord into the water. In one account I read, it said that in court, during cross-examination, Lisa Thomas said that Josefina was like Heidnik's girlfriend and was so angry at her for what she had done, and basically said that she was on his side. And then it said that Jackie actually stood up for Josefina and backed her up and was like, she was under the same threat that we were all under. This testimony was somewhat the opposite, and Jackie was the one who was angry with her and Lisa backed her up. I don't know, but ultimately Josefina Rivera was in a very unique situation throughout this whole thing, because ultimately her plan did work and she did get everybody freed. She's smart.
It just became he just created his own little world in his basement, and everybody just kind of pretty much dealt with it, I guess, in their own way.
The proceedings ended with Dr. Paul Hoyer of the County Medical Examiner's Office giving evidence regarding the body parts and other human remains found in Heidnik's kitchen. Dr. Hoyer read out the items found: 2 forearms, 1 upper arm, 2 knees, and 2 segments of thigh, all cut with a saw, the tissue, muscle, and skin still attached. In all, 24 pounds of human remains were recovered, found carefully wrapped and stored in Gary Heidnik's refrigerator. Obviously, Gary Heidnik was indicted and held for trial. Now for Gary's money. Gary also ends up in bankruptcy court. On May 8th, counsel representing the creditors committee, the church, some of the victims, Provident, Merrill Lynch, Heidnik's wife and child, he's talking about Betty, the IRS, the Commonwealth, the Veterans Administration, and the Peace Corps, and the city all appeared. The parties agreed to submit the motions on a stipulation of facts. This is the thing that's most messed up. All of the survivors received a $30,000 settlement. Gary Heidnik had $500,000, and all of his victims received $30,000. Then again, there's a lot involved here. That's a lot of parties involved. It's all very complicated, so at least they got something. I personally just don't think that that is enough freaking money to make up for what they had to go through. It is very complicated though. It's a lot of paperwork, bureaucracy, systems, you know, and the IRS is involved, so. In September of 1987, Jack gets hired. Dr. Jack Apsh. We have heard a lot about him. He was hired on by Chuck Peruto, Gary's defense attorney, as a researcher. Jack had recently completed his doctorate in counseling psychology from Temple University in Philadelphia. The way that he actually landed this job is that Chuck had a cousin and Jack was friends with the cousin, so he just kind of got the job. But Jack would go on to write 2 books about Gary Heidnik. The first was Probing the Mind of the Serial Killer, which was published in 1993, and the second, Breaking the Silence of the Lambs, which was originally published October 10th, 2014. It was published 2 days before Jack's death. The difference between the 2 books is that the second one includes the 26 letters from Gary Heidnik to Jack, and it also includes more information about Jack himself and his personal life, and I think that it's a better book. Jack spent 3 months poring over boxes of files about Gary Heidnik, his criminal history, all of the evidence for the case, and also his psychiatric history, with the goal being to understand the mind of somebody like Gary Heidnik. Then he starts interviewing Gary and pretty much becomes an expert. And then after that, the 2 of them are writing letters back and forth. Jack is kind of funny. He said that when he met Gary, he actually sat down with him and was like, listen, when I was in Vietnam, I killed more people than the Manson family, so let's cut this shit. I think that he knew how to be like, I've seen enough. I'm not gonna fall for your crap, Gary. You shoot straight with me. I think that Jack was a good man for the job. He wasn't a super by-the-book person, if you will, and he was also a vet. I think that he was very well-rounded and good for this job. Trial. The main trial began in earnest June 20th, 1988. The courtroom was packed. City Hall Room 253. The jury was brought in from Pittsburgh in an attempt to put together an impartial jury. There was a panel of 16 residents, 12 jurors, obviously, and 4 alternates. Charles Gallagher outlined the prosecution's case in all of its horrific detail, and Chuck Peruto outlined the defense's case. Essentially, his goal, the plan, was to admit to everything, but plead insanity. His goal was to prove that Gary Michael Heidnik was certifiably insane. One thing that they did with this specific case is that half of the jury, 6 of the 12 people, were white and 6 of the 12 people were black. I thought that was interesting. I don't know how that normally works. I think different cases, like the way that the jury is picked, is going to be individual, but I thought that that was a good choice for this specific case. The prosecution gave their opening statement, the defense gave theirs, and then for 2 days, Charles Gallagher called in witness testimony. The testimony came from the captives themselves, families, police officers, and medical examiners. After the final witness from the prosecution stepped down and finished their testimony, Chuck Peruto stepped forward and asked the judge that the charge of first-degree murder be removed from the table because the intent to kill could not be proven. I love the judge, Judge Lynn Abrams' response to this. It was 1 word, and they just said, overruled. With a 19-year-old victim, Lisa Thomas, on the stand, this is something that she said. He put us down in the cellar. He said he wasn't going to kill us. He said, trust me, trust me. He beat us half to death. He fed us dog food and dog biscuits. He dug screwdrivers in our ears for us not to hear him. Sandy died. He was feeding her bread and water. I think he murdered her, to tell you the truth. Chuck Peruto's defense was centered around two people: Heidnik's psychiatrist, Dr. Clancy McKenzie, and then Heidnik's psychologist, Dr. Jack Apsh. Unfortunately for Chuck, he soon discovered that putting Dr. Clancy McKenzie on the stand was probably not the best idea, because Clancy wasn't really cooperating, I guess. He wasn't answering the questions like directly. Instead, he started off on a whole almost debate about schizophrenia. So he started talking in like medical terms and having this intellectual discussion about different medical conditions and mental illnesses and schizophrenia, and it completely confused the jury. So Chuck went with this to kind of summarize everything for them. He said, at the time of the offenses, did Gary Heidnik know the difference between right and wrong? And Dr. Clancy McKenzie said, no, he did not. I think that's bullshit. I think Gary absolutely freaking knew.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
I'm not defending him in court, so that was probably the best way to go about that for Chuck Peruto. Chuck then asked the judge to instruct the jury that Gary Heidnik had enlisted Josephine Rivera as an accomplice in these crimes. So he's kind of muddying the waters. He's taking blame off of Heidnik. And the judge said, I can do that, but if Gary Heidnik was able to convince somebody to do these crimes and he was able to successfully get an accomplice, then he is not insane. So Chuck Peruto totally dropped that. He decided not to go there. The defense had some pretty big setbacks, totally relying on Dr. Clancy McKenzie and Jack Apsh, because Dr. Jack Apsh testified for a day and a half, and he said, I was originally only hired as a researcher, but because I knew more about Heidnik than anyone else, I was asked to testify. Gary's whole insanity thing and acting crazy and whatever, well, the prosecution definitely picked up on this and they accused him of malingering. Malingering is faking symptoms. The judge said that Dr. Jack Apsh's testimony about Gary Heidnik's medical history or his mental conditions and stuff was actually inadmissible. This completely caught Chuck Peruto off guard because his whole defense strategy was that Gary Heidnik was insane. So if he can't use Gary Heidnik's medical or mental history to prove this, then he's going to have a difficult time doing that. Chuck believed that Gary's medical history would prove that he was insane. And also, Dr. Clancy McKenzie was kind of undermining his own credibility just by the way he was behaving, I guess. So the whole defense strategy was kind of falling apart. Chuck Peruto then tried to call another psychiatrist, Dr. Kenneth Kuhl. There are a number of problems with this. Firstly, Kenneth Kuhl, they had a closed session. Judge Abrams said that Kenneth Kuhl trying to explain to the jury Gary Heidnik's mental state was confusing them further. The judge ruled that this had to be stricken from the record because it was confusing the jury. And then on the stand, Dr. Kenneth Kuhl admitted that he actually only spent 20 minutes talking to Gary and that he left completely frustrated. So why? That's horrible testimony. Then the prosecution asked this new psychologist that was brought in, what did you base your testimony on? What did you base your professional opinion on? And he said Gary Heidnik's medical history, which was already considered not admissible to evidence. So, disaster. The prosecutor, Charles Gallagher, really knocked it out of the park with this last person that he brought in. This additional witness was Robert Kirkpatrick, Heidnik's broker with Merrill Lynch, and what he had to say really does not make Heidnik seem insane. He said that he knew Heidnik as, quote, an astute investor who knew exactly what he was doing. For the next few days following that, Charles Gallagher and Chuck Peruto called in various witnesses to try and prove and disprove each other and the like. Here's a quote from one doctor who saw Gary. "This man seems to feel comfortable only in relationships where he has the upper hand in that the other person is much weaker or less competent than he is." Gary denies all of these allegations against him. He says that the other captors actually murdered Sandra Lindsay because she was a lesbian. Heidnik is so crazy, he actually said this: "There were actually 3 deaths at 3520 North Marshall, not 2. When Sandy died, she was about 2 months pregnant, so 2 people died that day." Gary also said that he dismembered the body of Sandra for a reason. He told 2 defense psychiatrists that he stored the arms and legs in the freezer refrigerator to feed the babies when they were born. What? His sexual delusions were overpowering. If what Heidnik told these psychiatrists is accurate, it is obvious that when he discovered that Sandra was pregnant during the dismemberment, he did not simply throw the fetus away. Upon cutting her stomach from the top of the rib cage to pass the navel, he removed the fetus, his child. The child was dead, but no one would take it from him this time. He laid the child down on the table and watched it while he continued his laborious task of hacking Sandra Lindsay, the mother, apart. He cooked the fetus and fed it with rice to the hostages. No one took his baby away this time. He cooked the torso, head, and body of Sandra Lindsay. He kept what was his to do with as he deemed fit. In his eternal world, he was the deity. I don't know if any of that's true. I don't know if she was pregnant. As far as I know, she was not pregnant. Heidnik claims that she was. That's a story he told them, but I don't know. There's no way to know, frankly. This is one of the strangest parts of the investigation. Investigators found no blood at the crime scene after an exhaustive search. There was no blood found in any room. The investigators disassembled the traps and sewer pipes from the house all the way to the external sewer line. Samples were taken from the entire assembly, however, they found no blood. The answer to what happened to the blood comes from an analysis of interviews with Gary Heidnik. It is important to analyze Heidnik's thought process. Heidnik is logical, methodical, and very patient. As we have seen from his own words, he thinks through every move he makes. Since his actual life has been an internal life, he is at his best when he is in his own internal world. Therefore, it is likely that he rehearsed the disposal of the body frequently prior to the actual attempt of the dismemberment of Sandra Lindsay. Immediately after Sandra Lindsay's death, Heidnik put her body into the freezer and turned on every cold water spigot in the house. He had in his garage a small engine hoist he had used for automobile repairs. He disassembled the engine hoist and moved it into the bathroom. He reassembled it as a body hoist and mounted it over the bathtub. After allowing the body to freeze, like in a mortuary, Heidnik brought the body upstairs. He drained the body of its blood and fluids over the bathtub. As Heidnik, the licensed practical nurse and avid reader with a superior intellect, would have known, blood would also leave no trace in the traps or pipes because the pipes were chilled. It would move through them all into the sewer line. No blood traces could be found in the cold pipes or the bathtub. The body was hoisted to allow a downward drain of blood from the specific area where it collects on a dead body, dependent upon the position of the body in death. These simple logic steps provide an explanation as to why no blood was found. Perhaps more importantly, they show that the scene had been rehearsed over and over in Heidnik's fantasy until the details were perfected. What a sick fuck. The judge left it up to the jury, of course. The jury reached a verdict over about 2.5 days, 16 hours of deliberation. The jury completely rejected Heidnik's insanity defense. On June 30th, 1988, after about 2.5 days of deliberation, about 16 hours, they came back with their verdict. Betty Ann Bennett, the jury foreperson, stood up and read the verdict. For the murder of Deborah Dudley, guilty in the first degree. For the murder of Sandra Lindsay, guilty in the first degree. And this carried on for 18 different charges. Heidnik was guilty of all of them. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of rape, 6 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 count of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. With the verdicts announced, Judge Abram retired the jury until 9 a.m. The following day, when the prosecution and defense attorneys would have the chance to address the jury before the sentence was decided. Apparently, Chuck Peruto really thought that Gary would be found for lesser charges, like a lesser degree of murder, like 2nd degree or something. But he was shocked, I guess. By 12:15 the next day, the jury had made a unanimous decision. Gary Heidnik should be sentenced to death for the murders of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay. Just as he had throughout the trial, Heidnik showed no sign of emotion when the sentence was read. When Gary Heidnik got the death penalty, he said that he wanted to be executed. I say real or phony, they can execute me because I am an innocent and I can prove it. This is the end of capital punishment in this state. When you execute an innocent man, knowingly execute an innocent man, you know there will be no more capital punishment in this state and possibly anywhere else in this country. And you know I didn't kill them 2 women. Go ahead and execute me. Yes, I want you to execute an innocent man so there will be no more capital punishment. Oh God, okay. Well, let's go ahead and do it then. Talk about delusional. The whole trial lasted 88 days. The letters. After the trial, Jack Apsh, he's such a real person. I respect all of the work that he did. He was also troubled. He said that after the trial, he wasn't in a good place and that he really needed money. He's very honest about his struggles. He has since passed, R.I.P. Jack, but he talks about essentially needing to write a book. To get Gary to talk to him, initially Gary actually responded to Jack like a complete Machiavellian asshole, which is to be expected. Jack knew how much Gary liked to read, so he started sending him books. Jack is smart. In one of Gary's letters to Jack, he wrote, "Next, I'd like to thank you for all the books you've sent me and the Bible. Betty beat you to the punch on the Bible, though. She sent me a nice one already. Your taste in books is pretty good. I'm currently engrossed in James Bjork's The Day the Universe Changed, and I'm anxious to sink my teeth into the human zoo. For whatever narcissistic pleasure I can gain, let me say that I've just completed Homer's Iliad." Jack said, "The best I could do was to keep throwing him his favorite bait, books." Heidnik was a voracious reader, a barracuda for books. Maybe I was broke, but I was rich in books from college, graduate school, and many years of personal reading. So I could send him a steady stream of fiction and nonfiction. Sending books started as a way to gain Heidnik's trust. Later, when it was no longer necessary, I continued to send him books. In some strange way, I felt sorry for him. Gary was teased and humiliated throughout his childhood. Today we call that bullying and take it very seriously. I'd like to believe that I can see some good in anyone, even a sexual predator like Heidnik, or I was just a greedy profiteer looking to cash in on his misery, both then and now. You're free to judge my motives as well as Heidnik's. I'm trying to honestly describe and understand both Heidnik and myself during that turbulent time." As somebody who, quick aside on the Gary Heidnik story, as somebody who wrote a book recently and also has personal issues, I so strongly relate to what Dr. Jack Apsh was saying here. I really respect how open he is and just how freaking real he is. I felt like I could relate to him in this story. Jack's correspondence with Gary is super fascinating. Gary is often very condescending to Jack, so Jack had to put up with some shit from Gary, but he definitely got a lot of letters. Gary loves to talk. I don't think he really got that much recognition. Especially not financially. One thing I thought was interesting that John Douglas, you know him as the author of Mindhunter, was part of the FBI's behavioral analysis unit Psycho Squad. That's what they called themselves when they went and interviewed different killers. And they interviewed Gary Heidnik.
It would be comforting to think that the movie Silence of the Lambs was pure fiction. It wasn't. It was based on real crimes in a real FBI unit, which is known affectionately as the Psycho Squad. We went to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, to see how the unit gets into the minds of some of the most savage serial killers and rapists, and to meet the head of the unit, FBI agent John Douglas. What I wanted to ask you about first was the movie. Did you like it?
I thought it was a tremendous movie. It was scary as heck.
You were scared?
Oh, sure.
That's great. That's
great. Because unlike the real cases, in the real cases, we don't have the music in the background.
Agents Douglas and Ray are on their way to talk to him on death row at the Pennsylvania State Prison in Pittsburgh. It'll be an interview that lasts 6 hours, an experience they hope will help them get into the mind of other ferocious criminals and torturers.
That interview footage, that rare interview footage, is from John Douglas's interview with Gary.
Why do they kill?
The primary motivation is to manipulate and dominate and control that victim. How can this inadequate nobody, for the first time in his life, call the shots and decide whether or not this victim should live or should this victim should die?
I actually think that the letters that Dr. Jack Apsh exchanged with Gary were far more enlightening and interesting than the interview that John Douglas did with Gary. Though I do understand that it's a singular short interview. As far as I know, they only did one. So of course you're gonna get more from like a long-term relationship of writing back and forth with somebody. It's very clear from these letters that Gary has a huge ego. In letter number 5, Gary mentions Josefina Rivera for the first time. He actually says, "Perhaps my needs were best summarized in 4 words by Rivera, a psychologist in her own right, when she said, 'You're lonely, aren't you?' Having correctly analyzed the situation, she then probably exploited my need for bonding to achieve her freedom." On November 19th, 1988, Gary talks about the deaths of Sandra and Deborah in one of his letters to Dr. Jack Apsh. There are several questions regarding the 2 deaths I was convicted of that I wish to address now. I've already addressed the question of intent. There certainly was no intent on my part or Rivera's part to kill either woman, and I think I've already made that particularly clear in other letters. For some reason, Peruto never properly addressed this issue of intent, possibly because he could sell more copies of his book if I got a death sentence. Another aspect of their deaths is the technical aspect. From purely the technical aspect, neither death seemed possible, hence my bemusement. Oh, Gary. Let's first consider Sandy's death. Everybody has been saying I hung her by her arms from the ceiling. The use of the word hung or hang is entirely inaccurate. Sandy was not only not hung from the ceilings, she had both feet solidly on the ground and her arm was at a right angle, not even fully extended like so. And this is easy to prove. Nobody has to take my word or even ask the other women. The ceiling cellar rafters are about 6 feet from the floor, and the eye bolt or hook was screwed into the bottom of the rafters. Sandy was about 5 foot 5 inches tall. The handcuffs add another 6 inches. So Sandy's arm wasn't 6 feet high, but more like 5 foot 5 inches from the ground. This shows definitely that she wasn't hanging from the ceiling as the news media claims. But of course, they're not interested in being accurate, only in selling papers. Both her feet were on the ground. She simply was forced to stand up. If standing is dangerous or fatal, there'd be a lot of dead waitresses or sales clerks. Nut job. Also, she wasn't standing all that long. An hour and a half to be exact. She spent the whole previous night standing up, about 12 hours without ill effects. Gary Heidnik wrote long letters to Dr. Jack Apsh. He calls Deborah Dudley's death an enigma and says that Sandra was never hung up and that she had both her feet planted on the ground and that he was the most shocked of all by her death. He's infuriating to listen to, really. Gary's letters are so fucking pretentious too. He talks about his IQ and how smart he is. While in prison, Gary also tried to write a book. He calls his book Life in the Slow Lane or 40th Street Soaps. Dear reader, you are about to take a ride on a literary roller coaster. At all times, I endeavor to be entertaining. I will throw at you literal doses of laughter, comedy, pathos, and so. But I'm warning you ahead of time, you have to be wary of me. When I have you laughing and giggling, or lost in some poignant experience and you've dropped your guard, I will hit you with some profound piece of logic regarding the plight of the disabled. This is a story of fact, not fiction. He goes on. He says it's not a story for the squeamish or the faint of heart or the naive. He says that he hopes after you read his book, you'll have a greater appreciation for the handicapped. Respectfully, Gary M. Heidnik, author. Gary officially gets his death sentence March 2nd, 1989. For capital cases, there is a statute that requires an automatic appeal. So following the imposition of sentence, appellant filed a direct appeal to the court. But Gary wanted to die. Appellant has since expressed his desire to have his execution carried out as expeditiously as possible and has consequently instructed counsel not to pursue aforesaid appeal. So Gary was like, I get it. I get that there's an automatic appeal when you get sentenced to death, but please just kill me. Regarding his first appeal, it's ultimately not up to him. The appeal is made on his behalf and it is made automatically. The main reason is so that the sentence is in line with the Commonwealth's death penalty statutes. Basically, you get the automatic appeal to like double check your case to make sure an innocent person is not being sentenced. Obviously, Gary is far from innocent, and his sentence is upheld. This direct appeal goes through December 3rd, 1990. Newspaper comes out in March 1991 that this appeal was held for Gary. It is such a slow process. On January 16th, 1991, the State Nursing Board revoked Gary Heidnik's nursing license. They said that they didn't need to rush to do this because, you know, Gary Heidnik was already in jail. In September 1991, Gary's old lawyer, Chuck Peruto, was indicted by a federal judge for cheating his way out of parking tickets. Jeffrey Dahmer was also arrested in 1991, and there were articles about the similarities between him and Heidnik. Gary is in the news for years. Finally, Gary Heidnik's execution is set for April 19th, 1996. I guess Gary changes his mind about wanting to be executed because there is a plea of incompetency. Gary is incompetent to be executed, and his date is pushed back. I'm oversimplifying this whole process. Gary testifies about his delusional beliefs and why he can't be executed. Then in 1997, he's set to be executed again. He is hours away from being executed in 1997, and the Supreme Court issued a stay of execution pending a competency hearing. Gary was actually ready to go this time and was confused as to why this happened. Get this shit. Maxine Davison White, his then 21-year-old daughter, argued that her father lacked the mental competence to make his own legal decision. He wasn't sane enough to decide to waive his appeals. What's crazy about all of this is that Maxine was raised by foster parents. Her and Gary didn't really have much of a connection. She was a pharmacy student at Temple University, and now she's trying to get her biological father off death row. She's worked with the Defender Association in Philadelphia, which is a group that's like anti-death penalty. Her efforts did get her father a stay of execution, but we all know how this ends, and Gary deserved to die. She actually filed a lot of appeals. She filed so many that it was described as being at a hectic pace. Finally, April 27th, 1999, these appeals were overruled and Heidnik was found competent to be executed. On May 12th, 1999, the governor issued a new warrant for Gary Heidnik's execution. Gary is now set to be executed on July 6th, 1999. His daughter, so naive. She said, "I don't think this is an appropriate response to criminal activity." After 11 long years, the date has been set, July 6th, 1999, and no appeals for a stay of execution are going to stop this now. As previously mentioned, for his last meal, he had 2 pieces of cheese pizza and 2 cups of black coffee. At 10:29 p.m., Gary Michael Heidnik was executed by lethal injection. At the time of his death, no members of his family had made arrangements to claim his body. Agnes Askins attended the execution, and so did the families of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. Lindsay's sister told the Philadelphia Magazine, "I went to the execution, but it was too calm and serene for me. I'm thinking execution is something like, turn around and let me shoot you. Instead, they just stuck a needle in his arm. He never looked at us, never acknowledged us, never said he was sorry. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look in our direction." She was not the only one who was dissatisfied by his execution. Agnes Askins said, "I watched him die. It didn't bring me no satisfaction." Josefina Rivera did not attend the execution. She actually told the Philadelphia Inquirer it would have been better for him to sit in a 4x4 cell. Gary Michael Heidnik was 55 years old when he was executed. Gary Heidnik was buried at Cheltenham Township, Montgomery, Pennsylvania. Epilogue. To this day, Josefina Rivera, Jacqueline Askins, Agnes Adams, and Lisa Thomas all have hearing damage to some degree because of what Gary Heidnik did to them. Together, they have filed civil proceedings to gain access to the funds in Heidnik's Merrill Lynch account and to divide them equally between them as criminal compensation. Agnes Adams did a TV show and talked about how she suffers from DID, dissociative identity disorder. Apparently, she has another side of her named Diane. Her sons said that she becomes a completely different person and that she doesn't remember anything when she becomes Agnes again. One of her kids said that she went into a rage one time and said, "I'm gonna kill you, Gary Heidnik," and she chased him with, luckily it was just a spoon, and tried to stab him with it. Josefina Rivera talks about her triggers, and in 2014 she published a book called Cellar Girl. Gary's old neighbor Alice said, "You can think someone is scary or nuts, but it never occurs to you that they're a serial killer. Luckily, we were a noisy neighborhood, and that scared Gary off." Luckily, Gary Heidnik is gone from this world, but unfortunately, there are lasting effects on the families of the dead and on his surviving victims. This was the horrifying story of Gary Michael Heidnik, aka GM Kill. To support me and the work I do, please consider subscribing to murderpm.com. That is Murder Pop Magazine, my platform where you can get access to many more true crime stories just like this one. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Victoria Evans. Be safe out there.